Shut up and sit down.
Alright guys, I'm Dodge, this is Bigmeks Workshop and Paint Studio, and today we're painting Haldor Icepelt of the Space Wolves. Kind of an interesting figure, lots of little details onto him, and that's why it's going to be quite a long video, so you want to settle in, get yourself a drink or something for this one. And it's officially my last painting tutorial of this year. We will be working on some other stuff in the background, but once this audio is done, I'm officially done, so I can start enjoying the holidays and get my drink on. Then the first thing we're going to do, as we start with a black primer, is we're going to use the Fang by Games Workshop. Now some of these colours you'll think, yep, that's how Games Workshop paint them, but we're going to do them in a glazing fashion rather than block colour and then adding washes. So as you can see here, my paint is extremely thin, and it's going to take a lot of coats to glaze that up. Although it's not that important at the moment, you could just go block Fang, but I want to leave a little bit of the black showing through ever so slightly underneath to make those shaded areas darker, as we're going to accentuate those now using Rust Grey by Games Workshop. And we're not going to cover the entire armour, we're going to start in the centre of all the pieces of armour and glaze from the shade to those centre pieces to blend those in. And that's going to give a much more three-dimensional look. After that, we're going back to the Fang, and we're going to start glazing back downwards, and the reason for this, it's just going to smooth out all that paint, any brush strokes or any patches. As I'm using a wet palette, that shouldn't really happen, but it can do if you disturb the paint without it setting fully. So I'm just going back in with the Fang and glazing the opposite way, trying to make that transition a little bit smoother than it was. Now we're going to add Fenrisian Grey to the Rust Grey, just a small amount, just to lighten it up ever so slightly, and start working again towards those centre points of all the armour plating. And as you can see, we're starting to get this nice three-dimensional look where the brighter colours are at the top. It's quite easy to do. I mean, this water, the consistency of the paint is almost water. You're just using what's left on the brush, this tiny amount, and that way you get a nice smooth coat, and it just takes lots and lots of layers. After that, it's time to put down in Agrax Earthshade. Now this is really watered down, because we obviously don't want it to go too brown here. This is just to add a little bit of depth and also blend those two colours together even further. So you want to keep this watered down because you don't want to lose any of your blues and greys that you've put on. Then we're going to go back to our Fenrisian Grey and Rust Grey mix and just re-highlight those parts up, but a little bit further up, leaving the shaded Fenrisian and Rust Grey just showing underneath that. Start working up, and we're building those hot spots even higher at this point. Me and Andy thought it'd be a good idea to do Space Vikings for Yule. We do like the idea of Space Vikings, I think it's pretty cool. They've got a decent look to them. I like the fact it's got a lot of ruins on here and other random things which we'll get to later on. Now after we've done the Fenrisian Grey and Rust Grey, we are now using Burnt Red by Model Colour. We're going to use that for the skin for the wolf pelt, and that's just going to be the base coat for that. It is a bit awkward to get in there with the brush. You want to be really careful while taking your brush away from the model that you don't pull it across the back of the legs or anywhere else. And before we put down any yellows, we're going to put a Morning Fang Brown to help the transition of the yellows over the black, because you don't want to paint yellow over the black. It's going to take you a lot of layers and you're going to end up with horrible thick paint on there. So if you just go straight from black to brown, it's going to help you build up a lighter colour over the black. This technique works with anything when you're trying to paint black, a light colour over black. And obviously now we're going to go to one of our yellow colours. We're going to use Avalanche Sunset by Games Workshop. This is really watered down, but we don't really need any of the Morning Fang Brown showing, so it will be a full coat over this. And just make sure you do it in a lot of thin layers, and be careful not to drag your yellow too close to those blues. You will start to tone those green, and that's not something you really want. And to start the pelt off, I'm going to start that with a Steel Legion Drab. It's just a good solid colour for that. As you can see, this is really watered down as well. It's going to take a few coats, but you want to make sure you're getting all the gaps and give it a good base layer, so you've got none of the black parts showing through later on. I've obviously built this model here in sub-assembly. One of the reasons is the axe that he has across his chest would just make it really difficult to paint his head and his face, so I've kept those separate. Next is a Recklin Flesh Shade Wash. This is really watered down, and I think I actually end up doing 2 coats of this. And you want to work that towards the bottom parts of the shoulder pad and the knee, leaving most of your Avalanche Sunset showing at the top, but you're going to want to go over the whole thing. But you just want a more orangey warmness to the yellow at the bottom to start off with, then we're going to build those colours back up again. Now we're going to use Carrick Stone, I almost lost my place there, with a very small dry brush, and this is basically an overbrush. You want to be careful not to flick any paint anywhere you don't want it, but I do find with dry brushing you end up with these little bits of pigment that when you put a wash on they just end up places you don't want them to be. I don't really like dry brushing myself, but for fur coats and terrain it's a really useful technique. And now we've got a good tone on that. We're going to put an Agrax Earthshade to add the depth. So what we've got here is a nice Steel Legion drab fur with highlights on it, but we're going to tone the highlights and the fur down together so they blend, and then we're going to build those back up again. This is only watered down slightly because I want a dark base to work with, because at the moment there is absolutely no depth in this pelt. You really want to bring that depth out, and it's obviously got an interesting shape to the back of it, so I'm going to have to work around that as well. And after that we are using Medium Yellow by Model Air. Not one I usually use. It's a bit of a pale yellow rather than a bright yellow, because I decided I wanted to go more pale as the armour gets paler to the top, so we want to carry that across the palette. We want our yellow to be more pale towards the top as well, so it looks like light and not a colour transition. Then we're going to just Fenrisian Grey on its own by Games Workshop, and picking out the corners of the armour even further. Again, all of this has been done pretty much with glazing techniques. Just using a wet palette, mixing it so it's almost a coloured water, and removing almost all the paint from your brush and just using what's left. And then you just drag that colour from the shade to the highlighted areas. Now, a colour I don't seem to use that often is Carmine Red by Model Colour. I just thought I'd try this one out. It's quite a rich red. Although, in hindsight, it didn't work as well as I'd hoped for a base. It's one of those weird model colour paints that seems to end up glossy, even though it doesn't say gloss on it. There's also the gory red that Andy uses that does the same thing. Next up, we're going to start working on his head. And to start that, we're going to use Elf Skin Tone by Model Colour, which is a sort of yellowy pink sort of skin tone, and it makes a good basis to start with for this technique, because I'm going to put shade in, then bring it back up, then put more shade back in. So I decided I'd start with the middle tone. Then I started using Harvester Flesh by Scale 75, which is a little bit more pink. The elf skin tone did make a good base, but I wanted to tone things up. Now I know you can't see this very well because of the exposure on the camera, but I do try and fix that in a minute, so you'll have to let me know what you think about this technique for painting skin and also recording painting skin, because the light colours don't show up very well. And as you can see, I jump back and forth here as I'm waiting for things to dry, so we're going to use Balthazar Gold for the Aquila on his chest plate. It's also going to be one of the colours we use for the wolf skulls on his arms and everything else similar to that. So there's not much in the way of metallic colours here, there's only a few parts to do. Then of course the other main metallic colour we're going to be using is Lead Belcher by Games Workshop. Keeping this watered down as well, trying to get a nice smooth coat. Take several coats if you need to, which you probably should do. And be careful not to get any of that silver on the reds that you've been working on. Next up we have Hashnut Copper by Games Workshop. And I'm using a small Winsor Newton Series 7 brush. And what we're doing is we're just painting each individual feather on the chest eagle, and trying to leave the Balthazar Gold in the recesses for now. An overbrush will work for this if that's how you want to do that. but I was trying to pick them out individually, but at this point I felt like I'd forgot how to paint and I was messing it up a bit, but I'll come back and fix that up off camera. Next is a Shabty Bone with medium yellow, sort of a 50-50 mix, probably a bit more of the medium yellow, and that's made the medium yellow a much more pale yellow, and we're going to keep working on that to the top part of the shoulders. Blending that up, same way we've been doing the other technique, and now you can really start to see a good contrast between the base and the top. So at this point, I went over the Carmine Red with German Red primer, and then I decided I was going to start adding Corn Red instead across the straps, leaving the Prime Red, German Prime Red by Vallejo in the recesses. Now to start picking out some highlights to the axe, it's Steel by Model Air Metallic, which is vastly becoming one of my favourites. Started this by just doing the blade to highlight the blade, but then decided to feather this particular steel into the top of the blade as well. I do like the ruins on this. That little symbol at the top of the axe there is the Udal, the symbol of the Old Father, and I know that because I watch Dr. Jackson Crawford. I will put a link for his videos and his channel in the description if you're interested in ruins or any of Norse material, speaking Old Norse. He's got all that, so definitely go check his channel out. And the next colour as we work on the pelt is Shabty Bone by Games Workshop, and what I'm doing here is I'm watering it down considerably like a wash, then just feathering and blending it into those edges to highlight, and well, not actually highlight, this is actually a colour change, so we're going to blend that in and then blend it back out. And obviously after that I'm going to use an Agrax Earthshade to help blend those together. So we should have a high contrast now between the middle of the pelt and the outside of the pelt. You want to keep this watered down so you can stay in control of it, and we're trying to get the Agrax Earthshade a little bit more to the centre and any curvature and recessed areas on the pelt, because we do want that to add as shade, whereas we want the Shabty Bone to act as a colour transition. Next I'm going to start applying null oil to our metallic parts, which anyone would have guessed that's the next step to do for those metallics. Keeping it watered down, keeping it in control, you don't want to spill any of this on all that armour work you've spent ages doing. Then the knife on his holster, I mucked about with this quite a bit. I decided to use Brass by Model Colour. I ended up not being happy with it and having to mix other colours in to sharpen it up or make it look a bit more regal or fancy, because it just looked a bit flat and a bit dull. So Reckland Flesh Shade, as I decided the shade on the yellow wasn't quite blended as we've done those highlights, so I wanted to add that little touch of a warmth back to it, and enriching the base and the shade even further with that little bit of an orangey warm glow. You want to keep this really, really thin, do it in several layers. Next I was starting the wolf skull on his belt, which you'll have seen me do this one before, guys. I'm going to use Morning Fang Brown by Games Workshop and then start building that up. Keeping that paint really thin as it's a small detail and you want to be able to highlight it and everything else properly, so you need to give yourself some room there. So you don't want to fill in the eyes or the shape of it with any over the top paint. Next I want to start highlighting it using Zandri Dust by Games Workshop. If you wanted to do the skulls on his arms bone, you'd still do the same technique for that one, but I decided to do them in the same colour as the chest eagle. I'm not sure it really matters whether you do or don't do it that way. Next is a Shabty Bone, which I'm going to use the same technique we did a minute ago with the pelt, and I'm going to blend that even further towards the edges. So now we've got a bit of a transition between the Steel Legion Drab, the Zandri Dust, the Shabty Bone, and that should all blend really nicely, and we're going to add some more washes to that to make the wolf pelt come to life a little bit more. Now there's an Agrax Earthshade going down on the on the wolf skull, as you would imagine after doing a Xandri dust. Just be careful not to flood the features of the model with the Agrax Earthshade. You don't want to fill those eyes in too much, because it's such a small area, it will pull quite easily. And then of course highlight it back up with a Shabti bone, going for the top of the skull and any of the pronounced features like the around the eye sockets and the little bones around the back as well. And working towards any of the top areas. Obviously I'm using a really small Winsor Newton, I think it's a 00 at this point, but just use whatever brush you're comfortable with. And again we're back to the Agrax Earthshade wash, watered down, because we're going to use that a lot on these pelts. That's how we're going to blend the fur together, which is something I don't usually paint, to be honest. I don't think I've painted a pelt in years. Found it quite interesting, something different to do. And at this point I'm working the Agrax Earthshade into the centre there rather than around the whole thing. That's going to put some more depth into the very centre and help our colour transition there. Now I'm mixing a tiny bit of ivory by model colour into our Shabti bone, and I think this will be the final highlights on the bone feature on his belt. Now I'm going back to the chest eagle and I'm going to use Rune Lord Brass by Games Workshop. I'm going to start picking out the feathers, but about a third, just a third of the tips of the feathers, and we're going to start picking those out as well. We do use quite a lot of colours on this chest eagle. I just recommend using a very small brush for this, so you can keep your control, but you can keep adding washes and layers on. Of course, I'm also going to be using a pin wash, oil wash on this. So if you're thinking there's not enough depth, or if you're thinking there's not enough depth to it, there's going to be by the time we've finished. Now I'm going to use Carmine Red on the sheath for his dagger. Because it's a base paint, it's going to give some nice coverage, and it'll stand out quite a bit. Again, you want to be really careful not to get any of these reds alongside your blues or onto those blues, because it will really mess it up. Now I'm just using straight black. You can use any black you want here, but I prefer to use my Black Prime by Vallejo because I know it dries very flat to the model, and when doing freehand we'll find that kind of useful. You don't want any lumpy areas. So what I'm doing here is just trying to put the triangles onto the knee pad with freehand with a Winsor Newton Series 7 000, and you just make a very tiny mark in the middle and then work from the top to the bottom there. Always paint it slightly smaller than you want it to be, so you can paint it outwards as you go. I've also done the shoulder pad there as well, but definitely paint it that way, smaller, and then make it larger if you make a mistake. This is another Shabti bone, but it's a dry brush this time, and as you can see, those colours that we've put on the pelt are really starting to blend together and also give it some depth in the recesses. Now I'm actually using a null oil wash, and this is watered down, but as you can see I'm not going to cover the whole pelt there. I'm going primarily for the centre and the bits where there's curvature in the pelt, and definitely put it underneath where the backpack's going to go, because that's going to add shade to the model, or it would add a shadow to the model, so you want to make sure you've got your shadow there so it looks natural. And this is what I did to sort out the head. I decided to put a bit of grey card behind the back, and this seems to work with the exposure, because obviously I need it bright enough to pick up the face. You'll have to let me know what you think about that technique, guys, whether you think the video quality came out better for this one. And this is Harvester Flesh by Scale 75 on its own. And we're going to use this to start picking out the chin, the eyebrows, definitely the top of the head, as he is bald. And just take your time with this, glazing very small layers up. As you can see, it's definitely worth doing it that way. Now we're going to use Harvester Flesh 50/50 with Moonray Flesh, both Scale 75. You can get all these colours from the Scale 75 set in one set, I think. And we're going to start picking up those same areas, but a little bit brighter and a little bit further along. You want to keep in control of this paint. Best to work on the brow and the forehead, and then you can measure up how the rest of the head looks by the comparison of the face, and you can figure out where exactly you want those highlights to be. Now, I didn't want to use a straight Drushy Violet because I think it's too purple, so I mixed Null Oil and Drushy Violet together, thinned it down a lot, and then I'm giving the whole head a bit of a filter rather than a wash. Just bringing out some of that colour again using this, as you'll see. I'll also blend all those hard lines together or any mistakes, making the skin look a lot more smooth. Just make sure you go all the way around and not just focus on the face. You want to make sure you've got the whole thing. Otherwise you'll end up with brush strokes and lines that you've missed. And I decided to pick out the wolf paws with a bit of dryad bark to add a bit more colour to them, make them stand out a little bit more from the rest of the pelt. And as you can see, that null oil sat in there very nicely and added some nice colour into there. Next up is Rust by Model Air. I'm going to use this to highlight the underneath of the pelt because we've not really done anything on it, but there is some curves to it and there's some shapes, so I wanted to just add a little bit more colour in there, but the rust can also act as a bit of a fleshy colour. And obviously at this point the reds that we left on there are a little bit stark. Now, at this point, if he's been wearing this pelt a while, I don't think the underneath flesh would be this red, so decided to stick this on and see where we're going with that. We'll come back to that later, I think. Now it's Harvester flesh and Moonray flesh again, but this time it's 70% Harvester, no, it's 30% Harvester, 70% Moonray. And as you can see, this face is really coming along. We're working on the bridge of the nose, the creases in his forehead. These areas that we're painting are just getting smaller and smaller as we progress. Those purples and everything else that we've left, they're now sitting in the underneath, really adding depth and in comparison to the highlights that we've done, and really bringing the face to life. Now, to do his hair and his beard. Mechanicus Standard Grey is what I used as the base here. You want to be very careful not to spread this anywhere you don't want it, but it does make a good solid base, it being a base paint. And it will go straight over that black rather nicely as well. We're going to do his beard and his ponytail or his plaits with this. After Mechanicus Standard Grey, we're going to use Sky Grey by Model Colour. In very small amounts, and all we're going to do is paint the highlighted areas. We're going to paint each individual strand of hair that you can see on the model itself, leaving the Mechanicus Grey underneath. Because the work area is so small here that that high contrast is really going to bring out the depth and detail, rather than trying to paint in a lot of washes. It's not going to work that way, it's not going to look as defined. Now the little bit of metal around his braid, I decided to do Bright Brass by Model Air Metallic, and I didn't really do much else on that. If I did it off camera and it would have been a wash and then another highlight of Bright Brass and then a Bright Brass and a little bit of steel. It's simple stuff. If you follow our channel all the time, you'll realise there's a lot of these same sort of patterns that we will follow to get to a certain result. Now we're using Model Air Metallic Rust. This is rather watered down. The idea here is I wanted to add a little bit more richness and a little bit more red to that plate after the Rune Lord Brass. So it's almost a wash consistency, and we're just going to let that start to sit in those recesses and make sure we don't let any of it sit on the top of the breastplate. Now it's just Moonray flesh on its own, which is the more yellowy flesh, scale 75. The reason for that is on the actual artwork for him, he's got sort of a much more pale skin from living in a cold environment, and I think it came out quite well. I spend a lot of time focusing on the top of his head, and I do realise there is a slight mould line there which I thought I'd got, but it was too late once I'd started painting it, which you will realise cleaning that mould line, sometimes you think you've got it and then when you start painting it really starts to show up, which is a shame. Sky Grey plus Ivory, and we're going to just keep picking out the top parts of each of these hairs now, leaving the last colour in the recesses, and it's really starting to give it some definition. I do believe this one is going in the prize pool for our monthly giveaways as well, so that's something to look forward to. Now null oil is not used for the entire hair. I'm basically pushing it up and under into any of the recessed areas. It's very watered down, just to add a little bit of depth without taking away any of those highlighted colours that we've put in. So basically I'm painting that wash in individually, just to add a little bit more definition to that beard. And then I'm going back to Fenrisian Grey, because as you can see, I've started putting the model together, so now I can see the whole thing. I just decided a bit more Fenrisian Grey on those highlight spots would be worth doing, just to brighten them up a little bit more. It's really up to you how high you want to take your highlights for these. And I do realise the highlights on the backpack are not the greatest. Then I'm using Pale Grey Blue by Model Colour, which is a real nice highlight for this set of colours. It blends and, well, it matches it matches just perfectly with the scheme, and we're going to use that for the edge highlights. Definitely want to take your time with that one. I'm using a Winsor Newton 000, just so I can keep in control of those brush strokes, and obviously don't overload your brush, so you don't want big white bluish lines across everything. Next I'm going to use Eshan Grey by Games Workshop, and we're going to use that to highlight the blacks across the bolt gun. Those ruins on the gun are quite difficult to highlight or get in there to highlight. They're quite a small surface, and they're also not something you can get on camera easily either, so haven't really shown any of that on camera. Next we've got Mephiston Red by Games Workshop, and we're going to start working to the edge of each of these leather straps. So you want to do the left and the right side of both. You can leave these quite thick as long as you leave the red in the centre of the strap, the darker red. It will start to act as a transition, especially on a scale that small. The eyes will only really pick up the sharp edges and the blend in between. Then I'm going to use Squig Orange, and this is essentially the edge highlight for each of these straps. So you want to take your time with these, and if you think there's not enough definition on that axe, it's fine, because later on I'm doing an oil pin wash and that'll bring in all the depth again. Then to add a little bit more warmth to the breastplate, because I still wasn't happy with it, I decided to put on a Reclan Flesh shade with a small amount of water. It's actually quite a strong Reclan Flesh shade, but that's really going to warm up those brass parts. And then on top of that there'll be an oil wash in those deep recesses. So after that I decided I'd pick out the sheath again with a bit of a brighter colour, so I went for Wazdaka Red, because it just didn't look right. It looked a bit too dull in comparison to all the other colours, so it needed brightening up a bit. After Wazdaka Red, I went back over the metal parts of the sheath as well with Model Air Metallic Gold, just to neaten those up, give it another layer, because I do realise it was quite patchy and I'd not done too much with it. I'm not really a fan of doing golds, as it's not really my palette. I prefer muted tinny colours and brasses, so I did struggle with this one a little bit, just deciding what colour to use. I decided I'd pick out some more of the paws for the wolf pelt as well, with a Gothor Brown by Games Workshop, because the fur stops and then you've got the actual paws themselves, and I decided I'd pick out the highlights on those, just Gothor Brown, and later on we'll pick out the claws as well. It's definitely a model that's worth building in sub-assembly so you can get to that pelt properly, so don't glue your backpack on. Probably don't glue on the left arm either. Now, Game Colour Sepia Wash was used here to enrich that gold. Because on the actual artwork that's quite an enriched gold. It's a bit more reddish, and to be honest the Game Colour Sepia worked really well for that, to be honest. It's a slightly different colour to the Games Workshop Sepia, and it just seemed to work perfectly, so I'll probably try using that with some other techniques as well. Now to pick out all the jewels, quite a simple step. I think it's pretty much what Games Workshop would do. So I'd have them black, and I'd start with a corn red, and the corn red would cover almost most of it, leaving a little bit of black shade in the deepest recesses around the edges there. Then what we do is we start highlighting up the X shape across the diamond with Mephiston Red, doing about 2/3 of the top of it. 2/3 of the top of the diamond, you'd blend that from the shadows to the top. It's quite a small work surface, so it doesn't take too long really, as long as you keep your paint thin and your brush steady. Next up would be Evil Sun's Scarlet, and all we're going to do with that is colour in the centre of the X on that diamond. Just basically edge highlighting those, and that should bring in enough depth for those to start standing out. Next up is Drushi Violet as a wash for the sheath. Decided it didn't quite look royal enough or regal enough, so I added some purple in because that always works well with the reds. It makes them look a lot more enriched and royal. And then I'm going to switch to Wild Rider Red, and I think that is the final highlight on all the gemstones. Just the very tip. You can easily put a squig orange on the top of that if you want, just on the finest point. I didn't see the point in going any further, and I was also getting quite tired of painting this thing, so I did start getting a little bit lazy. But there's no limit to how far you can take this. Just take what you've learnt from the other tutorials we've done and apply it wherever you can be, like wherever you want to. Model Air Metallic Gold, which is the colour we used for the base of the dagger sheath, and we're going to start bringing that up just to the highlighted areas, and you can see that's starting to bring in some definition there now, and the blade doesn't look nowhere near as flat as it did. Primarily running those across the right hand side because of the shape of the body. Then I'm going to add Lead Belcher to the gold, just a small amount, and again work towards the right hand side of the blade where the light would be bouncing off of it, and that's going to make it look a little bit more three-dimensional. And we're nearly done with this sheath as well. There's a couple more colours I think to do, and then this video is finally finished. And just to tone those down one more time, a little bit of Reckland Flesh shade, just to make sure that Lead Belcher and gold combination blends in there just right without standing out too much. Then I'm going to start using Model Air Metallic Steel to edge highlight all of the metallic works that are silver, as you've seen me do in many other videos here. Definitely making sure the actual blade itself looks more serrated than the rest of it. It's just a case of bringing it up and washing it back down again. I'm also going to bring out those ruins a little bit as well in a second. The Shabty Bone is then, it's the finest and softest of overbrushes here. There's barely anything on it. It's just pure Shabty Bone. Barely any traces, just on the top parts of those wolf pelts to act as an actual light highlight rather than a colour transition. And obviously I've glued the arm on here and we're just about finished. And then I'm using a Shabty Bone to pick out the teeth. I didn't do too much on those. They just blended from black to a Shabty Bone, which is a bit lazy, but I also did that on the claws as well, just to finish those off. Like I was saying, I'm trying to get this finished, because me and Andy are trying to finish up for the year. Don't forget he's got a little ruin and some teeth on his pelt as well at the front, which we didn't really pay any attention to. It was just easier to show you the techniques on the back of the pelt. Then we're going to use a watered down Teclis Blue across these little coils and parts of the axe to make it look like it's got some power running through it. And I'm also going to put those in the Udal ruin at the top as well, just because I thought that would be fitting. And there you have it, guys. We're finally at the end of the video. Thank you very much for watching that one, if you watched it all the way. It was a lot of work putting this together. So, things I would change, I'd probably just take a bit more time, put them to one side, have some more patience probably. In general, it came out okay. It was nice to paint a pelt for a change that I've not done in a long time. We have to give a big thanks to all our support, those who have supported us now and supported us over the year. Our patrons up here, we've got Cliff Leonard, Joe Spearpoint, Laurel Tarley, Ludwig Hofbauer and Warren Brunsdon. You guys are our patrons who pay us the most. You guys help support this. You help buy these types of models, which we then give away in a monthly giveaways, so everyone's a winner. Speaking of everyone's a winner, go check out the Outpost, links in the description. They're our affiliate link. You get brand new models at a second hand price, all the painting materials that you want that we have that you might not have, and really fast service as well. And when you pay for stuff from them, we get store credit to buy more models to make more videos for you guys, so everyone's a winner. And that's all from us. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit subscribe. Do check out our other videos, and we will see you in the new year, guys. Thanks for watching.